business regarding an announcement from HMS on black-nosed sharks? Is there any other additions or changes to the agenda? Is there any objection to the acceptance of the agenda with that addition? Seeing none, the agenda is approved as modified. Next item of business is the approval of proceedings from the last board meeting. Any comment or discussion on those? Any objection to the acceptance of those? Seeing none, those proceedings are hereby accepted. Next order of business is public comment for any items that are not on the agenda. Is there any member of the public that would like to comment on an item not on the agenda? Seeing none, we'll continue along. Our next order of business today will be decision on draft Addendum 4, and I'll turn to Ashton to begin that presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, I'm going to review the public comment summary for draft Addendum 4 to the Coastal Sharks Interstate Fisheries Management Plan. I'm going to start with the timeline. So this addendum was initiated at the February 2016 meeting. The draft addendum was developed and approved at the May meeting, and then public comment and public hearings took place from June to July, and I'm going to present the public comment summary today, and then the board can choose to move forward with Addendum 4 or not. So I'm providing here an overview of Amendment 9 to the Highly Migratory Species FMP. So I'm presenting this because there was some confusion during the public hearings on why the board chose certain measures and what the board was moving forward with. So like basically what was the board picking from the HMS Amendment 9 to move forward with. And I'm going to start at the bottom. So in yellow are measures that were included in Amendment 9 that the board is not going to consider, and those include a federal commercial smoothhound shark permit, a recreational permit requirement, a modified VMS requirement, and observer requirements. And I should also note that Amendment 9 is specific to smooth dogfish, as is draft Addendum 4. So all these measures are specific to smooth dogfish. In green, what the board has already considered. So the board has considered a federal commercial shark dealer permit. This was in Amendment 9. The board has already passed that. That was in the Coastal Sharks Fisheries Management Plan, so no need to consider again. The board has already considered smoothhound shark quotas. These were put in place via Addendum 2, so the board doesn't need to consider those again. There was also sink and drift gillnet requirements in Amendment 9 that the board had previously considered. They were in the original FMP, and then they were taken out via Addendum 1, so the board's not considering those again. So what the board is considering is the blue box at the top is a 25% catch composition requirement to remove the fins of smooth dogfish at sea. And so that's the basis of draft Addendum 4 that I'm presenting today. So a quick overview of the Shark Conservation Act of 2010. So within it, there's a limited exception on the fins naturally attached policy. It allows an individual engaged in commercial fishing to remove the fins of smooth dogfish while at sea, provided certain requirements are met. So one would have to possess a state commercial fishing license that allows for them to fish for smooth dogfish. The vessel has to be located between the shore and 50 nautical miles of an Atlantic state, and their fin to carcass ratio cannot exceed 12%. So now the Shark Conservation Act interpretation. So with the final ruling for Amendment 9, HMS basically interpreted the Shark Conservation Act, and specifically the phrase within the Shark Conservation Act, commercial fishing for smooth dogfish, to mean a trip where smooth dogfish comprise at least 25% by weight of the total retained catch on board at the time of landing. So one would need to have at least 25% of smooth dogfish on board in order to remove the fins at sea. And so one could say that, you know, basically this addendum is kind of the Commission's interpretation of the Shark Conservation Act. So the management options that were taken to public comment include, it's very cut and dry, it's option A, status quo. So a commercial fisherman that's fishing for smooth dogfish right now can completely process smooth dogfish at sea. meaning the fish may be headed, gutted, and all fins removed year-round. There's no restrictions. Option B would be a commercial fisherman may remove smooth dogfish shark fins while at sea, provided smooth dogfish make up at least 25% by weight of total catch on board at the time of landing. So with that, I'll go through the public comment summary. Those are the options that were presented to the public. For public hearings, there were 5 scheduled public hearings. 3 of them had attendance. So 2 of them in Connecticut and New Jersey, they were held, but no attendance was there. The one in New York only had a NOAA Fisheries attendee, and then in Maryland and North Carolina, there were commercial harvesters that presented public comment. For the written comment, the majority of the written comments were actually from the public. As you can see, there were 3 harvester comments from North Carolina, and there were 4 organizations that provided public comment as well. So there's a total of 15 written comments, which I will review now. Okay, so the written comment summary, as I said, there was about 15 public and commercial harvesters that presented comments. For option A, status quo, the 3 commercial harvesters from North Carolina were in favor of option A to status quo. There was nobody who submitted a written comment who was in favor of option B, which is the 25% catch composition requirement. The majority of people were in favor of an option actually not presented and drafted in A4. They would like to require all smooth dogfish to be landed with fins naturally attached, regardless of a catch composition requirement. So in just kind of digging into what do they specifically say, those people that were in favor of option A or the non-option. So for three comments in favor of status quo, they said they wanted to provide the best quality product, which entails processing the shark immediately. They said that processing smooth dogfish is a very time-intensive endeavor, and one cannot afford to discard in the event that the catch composition requirement is not met. They also said the alternative, in their view, does not provide a conservation benefit. The 12 comments that were in favor of a fins naturally attached policy for smooth dogfish said that as long as there's a market for shark fins, then finning is a possibility. Therefore, a fins naturally attached policy is the simplest, most enforceable method for preventing shark finning. Moving on to the public hearing summary. So as I mentioned, there was 8 commercial harvesters from New Jersey and North Carolina that provided comment. All were in favor of status quo. Some of the comments that they provided were discarding processed fish will negatively affect the fishermen and the resource. That smooth dogfish is sold primarily as a meat product. Therefore, keeping the fins naturally attached will affect the quality. They were concerned that the at-sea weight estimates that they were doing may result in not meeting the catch composition requirement, and they might have subsequent penalties because of these estimates. They're not certain of how many, when they're at sea, when they're doing the estimates, they're not sure if that's actually, indeed, they would meet it. So then when they got to shore and were actually weighed, that they could be off a little bit. They also said that it could impose safety concerns if fishermen have to continue to set nets to reach the catch composition requirement. And some viewed the alternative as not providing a conservation benefit for the resource. And so it was a really quick presentation. With that, I will take questions on the public comment summary provided.
So before we go to that, with her indulgence, I just wanted to turn to Carol from HMS for a little bit more description. If we can go back to the slide about the interpretation of that 25% and SCA defining a smooth-nosed shark commercial fishery, and perhaps you could add some context to that with regards to that interpretation.
Thank you. Yes, so when we took a look at the Shark Conservation Act, we took a very literal meaning. So we looked through all the words, all the phrases, and we came across this phrase, commercial fishing for smooth dogfish. And we interpret that not to mean going commercial fishing and happening to catch 1 smooth dogfish or 2 smooth dogfish. You were commercial fishing for smooth dogfish. We had looked at a range of catch composition for this, ranging from 0 to 100%, At our draft stage, we actually proposed 75%. We received a number of comments indicating that 75% was too much and would actually increase discards because people wouldn't know until the end of the trip whether or not they had met the 75, so they would start removing the fins and then have to discard the smooth dogfish or decide to discard other fish. So looking at the data and looking at the economic impact, we actually decided to go with 25%. 25% was actually supported by the state of New Jersey in their comments to us. There were some states, such as Maryland and Georgia, who wanted to follow the ASMFC regulations. North Carolina did not support 75%, but did not specifically come out in support of 25% either. And then there are other states, such as Virginia, Florida, and Delaware, who provided comments to us that they didn't have any preference on the catch composition at that time. So that's a little bit of the context. We were looking specifically at that phrase of commercial fishing for smooth dogfish, meaning that you were fishing for smooth dogfish.
Great, thank you very much. So with that backdrop, I'll turn to the board for questions of Ashton on the presentation or anything regarding this element of this being a definition for commercial fishing with this 25% requirement. Bill Adler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It sounds like what we're trying to do here, according to the statement of the problem, is consistency with the federal and state FMPs. Now, apparently, the status quo that we have in our plan basically just says you can fin them, and the option B, the 25% thing, is that what the feds have, and are we trying to get on the same page with the feds at 25? Is that what we're trying to do here?
So we're presenting the option that would allow the ASMFC to, yes, have a complementary management as the federal government. Yes.
And if I may, Mr. Chairman, and which is that? The status quo or the option B?
Option B, the 25%.
Okay, option B puts us in the same ballpark with the federal rules. That's our problem.
That is correct.
Thank you.
Next, I had Emerson Hasbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ashton, for your presentation. As you recall, at the New York public hearing, the issue came up that since smooth dogfish are now being managed by HMS, that the federal regulations would extend into state waters anyhow. Were you able to resolve that issue?
We're going to pull up a slide for that. Just a moment, Emerson.
So I created this slide as a result of the New York public hearing to kind of say that these are all the different regulations that were in Amendment 9, and the one that the board chose to move forward with as a possible alternative is the one in blue. And so if a vessel has a federal permit, then the federal guidelines apply in state waters. The permit goes with the vessel, whether it's in state waters or in federal waters. But no, all of Amendment 9 does not automatically apply in state waters. It would have to be approved by this board.
Any other questions on the presentation on the addendum before we move on to the advisory panel report? Okay, seeing none. Lou?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is going to be brief once Ashton pulls up the slide. One more. Okay, we had 4 people in attendance on this telephone call. We did get an email prior to the call from one of the members that was unable to be there. One participant was in favor of a fins naturally attached policy, and you saw that in the majority of the public comments, but this is not option A or option B. One AP member via the email, who is a commercial shark fisherman, was in favor of the 25% catch composition, and 2 participants did not provide comments on the issue. I'm one of those 2 participants, and I see this as virtually a non-issue, which is probably why you had so little input. And with that, I'm not going to take up any more of your time. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you very much, Lou. Any questions? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to Mark Robson with the Law Enforcement Committee report.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Law Enforcement Committee had a teleconference call on July 8th. We provided you a written memo dated July 7th in your package summarizing the discussions and recommendations of the Law Enforcement Committee. In a nutshell, we do support and recommend option B, which would allow the at-fin sea removal for smooth dogfish. And the LEC makes this recommendation really in support of the need for consistency wherever possible between state and federal waters. That's the overriding concern here. Having said that, there was a good bit of discussion about the difficulties of catch inspections for these fisheries, and in particular for shark identification. But the LEC members also recognize that smooth dogfish does possess enough unique physical characteristics that would allow it to be distinguished with some training by the officers who are making these inspections of catch. And I would note also that there are opportunities for such training. I know NOAA provides, I think, quarterly workshops for shark identification that state and federal officers are able to take advantage of. The only other caveat, again, sort of continuing on that theme of the difficulty of catch inspection and shark identification, we do want to reemphasize how difficult this can be in terms of managing a routine inspection either on the water or at the dock. You're now talking about a fairly complicated and significantly involved inspection process, not only identifying the species among a mixed species catch, but in determining whether there's the right percentage of smooth dogfish fins relative to carcass weight, and now the determination that at least 25% of the catch is made up of smooth dogfish in order for it to qualify for the at-fin sea removal. So while these are not unenforceable issues, I think you can all recognize how difficult those multiple levels of inspection and check of catch can be, and it does require significant marshaling of resources. It's not something that's done casually by officers either on the water or in the field at the docks. It's something that they do have to kind of marshal resources to be able to do that and make sure that they're getting the data and information collected correctly and that they're making a good solid case if there is one to be made. That concludes my comments, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mark. Questions for Mark? Okay, seeing none, that brings the issue back to the board for potential action. What we would need to move forward with, assuming the board wants to take action, would be to select an option and then approve the addendum, if that's the will of the board, and then the last step would be to set a timeline for implementation. So I see hand up, 2 hands up. We'll start with Brandon and then go to Michelle.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Then I would like to make a motion, and I'll speak to it if I get a second. So I would like to move to adopt option B, which would establish a catch composition requirement for the commercial processing of smooth dogfish at sea.
Give us a moment to get that up, and then we'll ask for a second. Do you want the 25% specifically outlined here, or is that sufficient, Brandon?
I don't think it has to be. I think it's implied, but since that's what it says in the addendum itself.
Very good. Do we have a second? Okay, Emerson Hasbrook, second the motion. So the motion before the board is moved to approve Addendum IV with the following option, Issue 1, Option B. Motion by Mr. Muffley, seconded by Mr. Hasbrook. I'll allow Brandon the opportunity to speak, then go to Michelle, and then I'll go for and against the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we talked about, this is for a fishery that is targeting smooth dogfish, so the ability to reach 25% should not be an issue. I think we need consistency, and we have strived to have as much consistency between what we're doing in state waters with what we are with federal waters across all shark species. So I don't know why we wouldn't achieve for consistency in this particular issue. And I also think we need to think about protected species issues. This fishery is primarily prosecuted with gill nets, and I think we need to be cognizant of those protected species issues, and I think going by this and having consistency across the board will minimize those issues within state waters, and so I think it's the right approach. Thanks.
Thank you, Brandon. Let me go to Michelle since she had her hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm actually going to speak in opposition to the motion. I was actually prepared to make a motion for status quo for a number of reasons. It was noted earlier that North Carolina was not supportive of an interpretation of the statutory language to require any kind of catch composition threshold. We have a lot of concern that this isn't actually going to achieve any conservation benefit for a number of reasons. The majority of the harvest of these fish occurs in state waters, and in our state, the majority of that state waters harvest actually occurs south of Hatteras. There was no, based on the information that was used to determine this catch threshold, most of the fishermen in that area they would not have a Northeast permit necessarily, so they wouldn't be submitting VTR reports. So the lack of information from any logbooks collected in the Southeast concerned us. Additionally, this is a meat fishery. The quality of the meat depends on being able to process the fish immediately, and our concern is that this is either going to increase dead discards or increase targeting in order to achieve some 25% threshold, simply due to the fact that this is really a mixed bag type of fishery for the majority of our fishermen. The majority of folks are actually south of Hatteras. These fishermen are targeting Spanish mackerel and sea mullet, and so they're not necessarily going to have federal permits for other species anyway. And again, we just see this as actually increasing dead discards. So you have to make a decision when you bring that fish on board if you're going to be throwing it back or harvesting it right away. And if you choose to, process it, then you might be in a position of having to throw dead fish overboard, and we just simply can't support that. So I cannot support this motion. Thank you.
Can I have a show of hands of other people that'd like to speak? Got Jerry, Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jerry Schill, I'm a proxy for Representative Steinberg, North Carolina. Michelle already articulated North Carolina perspective from a technical standpoint, but the idea of consistency can be looked at another way. What's wrong with the states being leaders and the feds doing what the states decide to do? That's certainly from the bottom up rather than the top down. But I think that the states need to stand up for this and indicate that the best way to manage this fishery is the status quo. We are very aware of the issue of gill nets and protective species in North Carolina, and I really don't see the element of protection this adds to protected species by adding a 25% threshold. I think it's a moot point. Thank you.
Mike, were you going to speak in favor or against the motion? Against the motion. Okay, let me see if I can find someone in favor of the motion first. Carol, did you want to speak in favor, or did you just have something to add from the HMS perspective?
Thank you. So I wanted to respond a little bit to that. My understanding of the Coastal Shark FMP for this board was that it should be strive toward consistency with the federal FMP. In relation to Mr. Schill's comment about being driven by the state regulations, we are completely aware that the states do not have to be consistent with our regulations. We, however, do have the federal statutes that we do have to be consistent with, so we cannot always be consistent and go the other way and be consistent with the states. And I keep having a thought that keeps going away, so I will ask to come back to that.
Okay, next I'll go to Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I often sit here and speak in favor of consistency, and I think striving for that consistency is something that I'll continue to support on future issues. However, I share a lot of the same concerns that Michelle does regarding the type of fishery that operates in our state waters in Maryland, and that adding additional burden to non-federal permit holders who are fishing, commercially fishing and catch smooth dogfish is going to lead to regulatory discards. There's no doubt in my mind that fishermen who would normally have brought those fish home are just going to let them go dead or alive in fear that they will not be able to at the dock comply with the measure. So back to the consistency issue with the federal government, I'd say that the slide that was shown earlier in the presentation by Ashton, which addressed the yellow, the green, and the blue issues that are part of the amendment and haven't been considered by the states. There was the sink gillnet and remember the details of it, but there was another condition of the amendment which the states have said it's not something that we want to take on. I think this one last piece is again something that I don't think the states need to take on, and so I'm not going to support the motion as it stands. Thanks.
Do we have anyone else from the board who'd like to speak on the motion? Go back to Carol again.
So I remembered the thought that was in my head before. So it had to do with the consistency in relation to enforcement. We've had a number of comments, discussion with enforcement, discussion with states, emails back and forth with fishermen who are already very confused about when they need to comply with the federal regulation of the 25% and when they need to comply with the ASMFC. So it's been mentioned by several board members so far, if they have the HMS permit, they need to comply with the federal. That is correct. But it's beyond just the HMS smoothhound permit. It's any HMS permit. And a lot of these fishermen might have the HMS angling permit. If they do, they need to comply with the federal regulations, and that includes the 25%. So it's not just whether or not you have the federal smoothhound permit, it's any HMS permit. And that is why we think consistency in this case is so important, because we've already seen increasing confusion between the two regulations.
Okay, do I have any other hands? Okay, seeing none, I'm going to allow a moment for the board to caucus. Okay, the motion before the board, move to approve Addendum 4 with the following option. Issue 1, Option B, motion by Mr. Muffley, seconded by Mr. Hasbrook. All those in favor of the motion, please raise your right hand. Okay, please put your hands down. All those opposed, please raise your right hand. I have 6 opposed. Null votes. Abstentions. 1 abstention. Motion carries 7-6 with 1 abstention. Okay, so the next matter of business would be to go ahead and approve we'd go ahead and put an implementation date in place before we approve the addendum. Let's do the implementation date first. I'll need a motion for that. I'll need a motion then to approve the addendum together. Can we combine those two? So we can combine those two, and then just before we call the final vote, I'll ask if there's any other public comment on this matter. So I'd be looking for a motion at this point for an implementation date and approval of the addendum. Okay, I got my pair of binoculars out, and I found Brandon with his hand up.
I'll throw out a date, and we can certainly take comment on it. I'll throw out January 1st of 2017 as an implementation date, and then approval of Addendum 4 to the Coastal Sharks FMP.
Okay, move to set an implementation date of January 1st, 2018, and approve Addendum 4 with the option selected here today. Is there a second to that motion? I'm going to need a stronger pair of binoculars. Got one from Wilson Laney. Thank you, Wilson. We'll get that up on the board. Go ahead, Bob.
Just a question of clarification. I think, maybe I heard wrong, but I think Brandon said 2017, and I think you said 2018, but maybe I wasn't only halfway paying attention.
Brandon, is January 1st, 2017 the intention?
17, yes.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Okay, I'll turn to the board for discussion. Any further discussion on the motion? Is there any member of the public that would like to comment on the motion before we take final action on it? Okay, seeing none, given that this is a final action and noting discussion about some no votes to the original motion, we're going to call a roll call vote on this. We'll give you a couple moments to caucus, and then we'll call that roll. Okay, we'll go ahead and call the roll, and I'll ask Ashton to do that.
Okay, Maine, Massachusetts. Oh, is it here? Is it? Yes. Massachusetts,
Yes.
Rhode Island,
No.
Connecticut,
No.
New York,
Yes.
New Jersey,
Yes.
Delaware,
Yes.
Maryland,
No.
Virginia,
No.
North Carolina,
No.
South Carolina,
Yes.
Georgia,
Yes.
Florida,
Yes.
U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service,
Yes.
NOAA Fisheries.
Yes.
Okay, give us just a moment with the abacus. Motion carries with a vote of 10-5. Staff have anything else on this issue? Okay. Seeing none, we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is consider the 2015 FMP review and state compliance. Ashton.
Okay, so I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. So moving on to the next slide. So this is the Coastal Sharks 2015 FMP review. Very quickly, this is looking at the Fisheries Management Plan, which was implemented in 2009, Addendum 1, 2, and 3. And the focus of this FMP review was to review state implementation of Addendum 3. A quick timeline. So Addendum 3 was approved in October 2013. State plans were reviewed in February 2014, implemented in March of 2014, and we're now reviewing compliance of Addendum 3. Really quickly, the elements of compliance. So states were required to create the following species management groups. I won't list them, but you can see them on here. There's 8 commercial management groups that had to be put into state regulations. There was also a regulation to apply a minimum recreational size limit of 78 inches for all hammerhead shark species. So it was 2 regulations, fairly simple. The board did approve a de minimis request from Maine and New Hampshire, which exempted those states from Addendum 3. So with all of that, the PRT reviewed the state compliance reports and found all states to have regulations that are consistent with the FMP and associated addenda, with one exception. Connecticut did not provide a compliance report prior to the FMP meeting, nor was it prior to when the FMP review was finalized. So the PRT still needs to review Connecticut's compliance report to ensure those measures are consistent with the FMP. The board will be notified if there are any issues arise. But with that being said, the PRT would recommend that the board approve the 2015 Coastal Sharks FMP review at today's board meeting. The FMP review can be updated after, if necessary. Any questions?
Can you put up the last slide?
Which one?
With the de minimis, was there a de minimis request?
No, there's no de minimis request.
Wasn't there one?
No, they were already approved.
Any questions for Ashton? Bill Adler?
No, Mr. Chairman, I was prepared to make a motion.
Please do so.
I'll make a motion that the board approve the FMP review and compliance report submitted.
Is there a second to that motion? Steve Hines? Okay, motion to approve the FMP review and compliance reports as submitted. Motion by Bill Adler, second by Steve Hines. Any discussion on the motion? Is there any objection to the motion? Seeing none, the motion carries. Thank you very much. Next order of business, review and populate the AP membership. We'll turn to Tina for that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will be very quick. We received an application from Katie Westfall with the Environmental Defense Fund. Kim Fitzgerald, who is also with that organization, is no longer able to participate on the panel, and he suggested that Katie Westfall would be a good replacement. She was appointed to the he was appointed to the panel a number of years ago as a non-traditional stakeholder. So I put that nomination before you for your approval. As a second, before you move forward with that, I also wanted to note that we've had very poor participation on the Coastal Sharks AP since its inception, and would request that board members review their advisory panel members and replace them if possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tina. We would need a motion to approve that AP member. Robert, you making that motion?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. I move to approve Katie Westfall as a member of the Coastal Sharks Advisory Panel.
Thank you very much. Do I have a second to that motion? Seconded by Stu Michaels. Discussion on the motion? Any objection to the motion? Seeing none, motion carries by consent. Okay, our next order of business is to elect a vice chair. I see Stu Michaels' hand going up. Stu?
I'd like to nominate Roy Miller as vice chair.
I have a nomination for Roy, seconded by Mike Luisi. Any comments on the motion? Move to nominate Roy Miller as Vice Chair, Coastal Shark Management Board. Motion by Stu Michaels, seconded by Mike Luisi. Is there any objection to the motion? Seeing none, congratulations and thank you, Roy. I believe that will be for the February meeting, or will that be for the annual meeting?
February.
Okay, thank you. Okay, our next order of business under other business is an announcement from HMS on black-nosed sharks. Carol?
Thank you very much. I just wanted to announce that we have a new proposed rule out. It filed with the Federal Register today and publishes tomorrow. This proposed rule would affect any gillnet fishermen south of 34 degrees. We're basically proposing that the retention limit for black-nosed sharks south of 34 degrees would be 8 black-nosed sharks per trip. This is our attempt in order to keep the black-nosed and non-small coastal shark fishery open as long as possible, so the non-small coastal shark quota can be filled. In recent years, it has not been filled, and that fishery has been closing earlier and earlier as a few fishermen have been targeting black-nosed sharks. The comment period on this will end on September 20th, and we have a webinar scheduled for August 16th, a public hearing in Cocoa Beach, Florida, scheduled for August 24th. We'll be talking about it at our advisory panel meeting in September, and we'll also be talking about it at the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council meeting in September. So, thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Any questions or discussion on that? Okay. Seeing none, having completed the business of the agenda, we stand adjourned. Thank you all very much.
We'll start the Atlantic Sturgeon Board essentially right away once everybody can get set. We've got one presenter's got a pretty